Your film is now ready to be shown.
Good morning. I'm Justin Hendricks, editor of Tech Policy Press, a nonprofit media venture intended to provoke new ideas, debate, and discussion at the intersection of technology and democracy. One tech journalist whose byline always draws me in is Chris Stokel-Walker. He writes for multiple publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Economist, Wired, and The New Scientist. Now he's got a new book, and last week I had the chance to speak with him about it and how he goes about covering technology and tech policy.
My name is Chris Stokel-Walker. I'm a journalist and author, and my new book is How AI Ate the World.
Chris, I'm so pleased that you can be here today to speak to me about this book. This thing takes us on a tour of both ideas and also personalities and points of interest along the history of AI along the way. In Chapter 9, you write, AI advancement has been divided into eras by many key liminal moments. The befores and afters when an event, declaration, or technological change helped move AI forward or back, as in the case of the successive AI winters. So perhaps that's a good way to think about the scope of this. But you start with the backstory of the Pope in the puffer jacket, which I did not know had anything to do with magic mushrooms. Why did you start there?
Yeah, I thought that it would be a really good human place to start, because obviously I have, in a little bit of a spoiler alert, an introduction to the book, which I test the mettle of generative AI. So I essentially asked ChatGPT to see if it could do a passable introduction, and it ended up producing some pretty generic spiel over the course of kind of 593 words, and then decided to throw that away and said, actually, you know what? Human intervention is needed here. And the thing that I think makes us human are those kind of unusual phrases. And more importantly, people are at the heart of every single story. And so I wanted to tell this story of Pablo Xavier, who is a Chicago laborer, builder, essentially, who, as you say, found himself at the center of a media firestorm. And I kind of didn't necessarily act as his PR agent for a period of time, but I was the first one beyond, I think, a Brazilian journalist to get in touch with him and to try and then field the firestorm that resulted after he had taken a load of magic mushrooms, decided that he wanted to create AI-generated images of Pope Francis wearing a Balenciaga puffer jacket, and saw them shorn of their context and spread around the internet, offending the world's Catholics along the way.
A lot of the beginning of this book, covers some space that Tech Policy Press listeners are probably familiar with. The history of AI and ideas and technology, Turing, Asimov, Minsky, the military. You take us through computers and chess, computers and Go, etc. I want to start maybe around Chapter 8, Chapter 9, around this contemporary moment we're in, the founding of OpenAI, the emergence of transformer models. Is there something you think now, having done this look back, that is different about this moment we're in, or is this just one line along the trajectory?
I think there is a kind of significant moment. We talked at the start about this kind of element of liminality of the before and the afters. And I do think it is a dangerous thing to do, because frankly, in the grand, long history of AI, both before it got its phrasing and after, we've seen these kind of false dawns being declared of AI will become ubiquitous and will become common and will be supercharged within the next X years. And you can take your pick of whether you want to read the New York Times from 1954 or 1956 or 1958, or the reports in the 70s of how this is going to work and so on. But I do think that the generative AI moment is something different. I think it's the clock started ticking with the kind of adoption of the transformer and attention is all you need, and the 5 years from that, where basically OpenAI said, look, here's this new cool technology that we need to use to underpin our LLM, and the kind of, I guess, just the transformational impact of ChatGPT, the confluence of both the underpinning technology managing to make a step change, the pace of hardware development actually finally meeting the promise that people were often just literally putting down on paper because they couldn't have the requisite hardware to actually power this stuff. Finally getting to that point where kind of Moore's law bends up enough that we can start to think about this deeply. And then the killer use case. And that's the key thing, I think, is this was a technology casting around for kind of a perfect form of delivery for a long time. And with OpenAI saying in November 2022, let's just chuck this thing out there, see if it works in terms of ChatGPT, and it's suddenly catching the world alight, is, I think, a really interesting moment. I think that's why it's different maybe from those false dawns, and why actually I do think it's why I call the book How AI Ate the World, right? It's a recognition that all of the stars have aligned to make this a different moment than previous ones where we've said, actually, we'll all be living in a sort of Jetsons-like sci-fi future in the years to come.
This book does not, I think, paint a picture that's necessarily overly optimistic about the direction we're headed in. But you do, in this part 2 about impacts, you do spend a bit of time digging into possibly some of the positive impacts, even the extent to which some of these generative AI tools have given voice to individuals who may have found it difficult to communicate in past, a set of tools that are useful to people to express themselves.
Look, I'm a self-ascribed tech skeptic, tech reporter. I think that the pursuit of profit at the expense of people is quite a dangerous thing. And I think also on the flip side, we have some pretty bad ideas for regulation in terms of what's coming out of particularly leading politicians at the minute, although hopefully generationally that is changing as people become more aware of this technology from a very early age and start to realize the limits and the potential. But I do think it is important to highlight that actually this could have a really beneficial effect, and it already does. And so, yeah, for every kind of doomerish story, I have a guy in there called Ed Stackhouse, who is a Google rater, spent 10 years or so between 2013 and 2023. He used to work on a casino boat. That casino boat shut down. He then moves into this world of starting to rate Google search results for their validity and usefulness. Suddenly, one day in early 2023, he logs onto his computer, opens up his browser, and the usual thing that he'll see, and sees these generative AI results that he's being asked to kind of rate for their usefulness. And he's really panicked because he says, yeah, how can I possibly know, for instance, the multiple side effects and correlations of having multiple medicines in my body at once, which is a question that he's asked while having a 2-minute time limit on actually verifying that information. So that is the negative side. But I do think also for all of those issues and the scary stats of 300 million people displaced, as Goldman Sachs says, and 40% of the workforce having some part of their jobs touched by AI, generative AI, as the IMF says, there are benefits, and there are benefits even within those data, right? So Goldman Sachs, on one hand, says 300 million people could see their jobs affected, but also we'll see a $7 trillion boost to GDP. And it's not necessarily always by automation. It's not hugely going to be just a kind of new industrial revolution. It's a way of actually benefiting people. So I talked to Christina Philippe, who is a kind of strategist at Ogilvy, who uses this to get over the fear of the blank page, or a New Zealand civil servant who got his job because essentially he had the raw talent, but he didn't have the ability to express himself for various reasons in a way that would be conducive to getting him through a kind of job application and interviewing process. And once he's in the job, he thrives. I think that's the thing that people often overlook. And it's the book, as you say, does take a pessimistic view at some points, but I hope that it reflects a kind of rounded view of, for all of the risks, there are opportunities here, and it's incumbent on us all to balance those things and to make sure that we don't necessarily believe all the hype that these companies are saying about how this is going to be just an unvarnished success, but we also don't take a too Eeyore-ish view on the idea that actually either we're all going to be replaced or we're all going to be enslaved by some sort of grand terminator.
Well, just to take the Eeyore-ish view for a moment, you do spend a bit of time on the doomers. Spoke to a good number of them, folks like Eliezer Yudkowsky. This question about whether eventually artificial general intelligence can be containable. I don't know. What did you get the sense of when we even need to be worried about those things? I mean, clearly there's a lot of folks who are playing thought games at the moment, various exercises that they enjoy doing, letters they enjoy writing, but still seems a bit off. Or what did you get the sense from your reporting for this book?
Yeah, it's interesting you say, they've been playing these thought experiments lately. And truthfully, they've been playing those thought experiments for kind of decades and playing them out ad nauseum and saying, this is the thing that's going to scare us tomorrow, and hoping that they continue to be heard. Look, I respect their views. They know far more than I do often in this instance because they are specialists in this field. But I will say it's a small minority who are shouting very loudly, and they're being outnumbered significantly by a group of people who I tend to respect. And so I come down on the side that we need to be realistic about this. Actually, the fear of the existential threat is, I think, being co-opted at the minute by a lot of people who have an interest in trying to disguise some of the more pressing issues. They hold one hand up and say, pay attention to this, while they're pickpocketing us in terms of our copyright and having lots of issues around bias and representation and environmental impacts that I think are more important. But it doesn't mean that I don't respect the people who hold these kind of more existentialist, doomerish views, because they could be right. Stranger things have probably happened. I just think it is unlikely to be that case. And I also think it would hopefully get to a point where we could just pull the plug. It's interesting. I got asked, I'm doing kind of a book tour, and one of the questions that I got from the audience, I showed up on screen that I put into DALL-E to get. I do a little parlor trick of my own, as many people in the history of AI do, where wherever I go around the country, around the world, I do a little visual representation of the town or the city that I'm going to be talking at, and ask DALL-E to please present it, a vision of this city in the style of Starry Night, because I think that's a thing that everybody knows. And so it always gets a laugh. And someone at the end of one of these talks put their hand up and said, I noticed that in the prompt that you put alongside it, you said, please give me this and that. Is there a reason why you're being so polite to the LLM? And I said, well, yeah, there is actually. It's because in the 0.00001% chance that actually AI does become sentient and start to enslave us all, I want to make sure I'm on the right side of history. So, yeah, never say never. I don't believe in ghosts, but also I don't badmouth them too much in the eventuality that they might come and haunt me.
I may be in trouble in that case. I will say that you then go through some of the more immediate concerns that folks have. Talk to a lot of folks who, in fact, have been guests on this podcast in the past. And I enjoyed, in particular, your look at disinformation through a thought experiment about perhaps one of the more controversial issues on the planet, whether to put pineapple on pizza.
Yeah, it's a terrible, terrible decision. I did a talk where my dad was, and he likes pineapple on pizza. He felt really offended, actually. He was sat in the front row and he just chided me with his eyes. But yeah, look, we're in a year where elections are becoming increasingly important in the UK. Dame Wendy Hall, who is someone who I really respect, about a month ago, one of the foremost thinkers on AI, she said that it was too late to do anything about the risk of AI in elections. For the book, I spoke to a guy called Eddie Perez, who was at the OSET Institute, was previously heading up Twitter's response to elections before Elon Musk took over and everything changed there. And, both of them are a little bit worried about the potential of generative AI. And I think what I did in the book was just get a generative AI tool to basically just present arguments for putting pineapple on pizza in a way that shows to a general audience who maybe haven't thought necessarily about this too much. And listeners here will definitely have thought about that an awful lot, because the book is aimed both like specialized audiences to maybe learn a little bit or to provoke their thoughts, but also in a general audience to try and get them to think and maybe worry a little bit more about this. Just how easy it is to generate stuff at scale. And you only need to look at the 2016 US presidential election, the Internet Research Agency based out of St. Petersburg, where they had to employ almost literal soldiers sat in front of computers typing out in the comment sections of our news website stuff that is designed to probe and poke at our differences and divide us. Now you don't need to do that. Now you basically just need a subscription to a kind of an LLM of some sort and the ability to generate that on a scale that we've never seen before. And actually, one of the things that I touched on a little bit in the book, but actually has been crystallized a little bit more as a result of further research that's come out is quite how good LLMs are at being persuasive. So there was recent research that I wrote about for New Scientist that showed, chatbots, AI-powered chatbots can essentially deprogram people who have adhered to conspiracy theories. And if you think about it that way, that's great. But then if you think about it the other way, can they do the opposite? And is that a little bit scary?
Absolutely. And that paper by David Rand et al. It's one that came across my desk as well. But the goal of being persuasive appears to be baked into the design of these products. I know Anthropic regards it as a sort of central feature of what they're trying to do with Claude and the products they're developing.
I think that is both a kind of a good thing and a bad thing. It certainly helps with the adoption of these tools, but it also causes concerns. And yeah, we're talking the day after OpenAI released GPT-4o. And I just did an opinion piece of The Guardian where I said, this is fantastic in terms of the adoption of generative AI amongst the public, because it is worth remembering we sit in our bubbles where this is obsessing us, and it's been the topic of a lot of the podcasts that you've done recently, and quite rightly, because it is important. The vast overwhelming majority of the public have never used a generative AI tool, and I wonder whether that is in some way because of the friction that's involved in that actually they still have to type stuff out. Whereas if you get to GPT-4o and the idea of innately interacting with someone on a conversational level, and the goal of, as you say, Anthropic to make Claude as persuasive, as friendly, as outgoing, as quote unquote human as possible, all of that can add up to both good and evil, depending on which way you put it to. And one of the issues, I suppose, is the extent to which these companies put in guardrails. Anthropic, I think, seems like a pretty good actor in that space. They seem to think a lot deeper than many do, from my viewpoint. But the challenge is, as with all of this stuff, it's you build it and then you try and figure out the issues afterwards.
You touch on so many different issues here. Certainly Eddie Perez on elections, someone I respect on that subject as well. I've had the opportunity to talk with Eddie in the past. You talk about the copyright wars, this question of fair use. I wonder where you come down on that as a journalist, as someone who is for a living putting words onto legacy media sites. Where is your mind at the moment on whether training these systems on the open web is the original sin, the kind of great hoovering up of all of humanity's intellectual property and a crime, perhaps, maybe on the one hand, and I guess the other fair right or the fair use maximalists on the other hand, who just regard these training models as having the right to learn like anyone else?
Yeah, and it is difficult because the difference is in scale. A human being can do something similar to those kind of maximalists who say, well, this is fair use and it's just what we would do, but they wouldn't ingest hundreds of thousands of stories at a time and rifle through them and then be able to regurgitate pretty passable mimicry. I'm lucky in one way in that a few months ago we had the kind of huge controversy around. I remember being on social media where the link to the seeing if your can't remember is it Books 2 or Books 3 database, the one that Meta used, that went around social media and people were starting to look up their names and see whether or not their books had been subsumed into the training data there. And I did that. Everybody else did. And actually none of my books at that point had been. So I thought simultaneously, I was like, oh, good. I've missed the kind of gaping maw of AI chewing me up and spitting me out. But also I felt a little bit offended of, oh, maybe my works aren't important enough. But then on the other hand, I write for places that have agreements with these AI companies and have signed them. So Business Insider, owned by Axel Springer, they've signed an agreement. So my stories for them There's an added wrinkle to me, which does rankle a little bit, which is as a freelancer, yeah, I do sign over my rights to this stuff, and I don't necessarily own the copyright for everything that I write for these publications, but also I made that agreement in a pre-generative AI era. And if, as we're seeing, publishers are wanting to get some sort of compensation with either brokering those deals as the FT recently did, or holding out and taking people to court as New York Times and the newspapers owned by Alfie Global Capital are doing, someone is getting paid somewhere. And I think we need to still figure out the kind of trickle down economics of this in a way that is fair, because ultimately, yeah, there will come a time where an AI chatbot can do a pretty passable impersonation of me, and that will have potentially a sort of, not a killer effect on my career, because the one thing I'm an educator, lecturer at a university in the UK, and I teach at the J School there. And the one thing that I'm pretty confident in saying that it can't do, and still probably can't really do very well, is effective interviewing and actually news gathering. It can't go out and speak to people. You still need a human in the loop there. So yeah, the copyright thing does concern me. I personally feel a bit uneasy about it, but I also recognize that you need high quality information, because God knows we don't want to be operating in an LLM world where it's trained solely by Reddit posts or Twitter posts.
We will see how all that shakes out. But by way of coming to the policy parts of this book, on to chapter 27, you get into taming big tech, you get into the regulatory environment. You speak with another person who's been on this podcast before, Carissa Velez. You talk about the risk to the planet. But you take a kind of dim view, I think, on where we're at on the regulatory moment. It doesn't seem like you think regulators are necessarily up to the task, at least based on past performance.
I think context is important here. So I've been reporting on tech more generally for a decade plus now, and my books before this were on YouTube and TikTok and kind of social media more generally, and the issues inherent in all of that. And I do think that it is starting to change, and actually we're at an interesting point where regulators and legislators alike are growing younger and more tech native, and therefore much more considerate of kind of the issues and producing good regulation. But I'm also sitting through legislative sessions where big tech executives are being asked about people's home broadband connections and essentially acting as a troubleshooter down at, I don't know, Best Buy in the US or PC World in the UK. And I think it's hard, right? Because there is also a huge dichotomy in the way that these two worlds work, right? The kind of current and frankly long-standing motto of tech companies is to be disruptive. It's Mark Zuckerberg's motto of move fast and break things, the thing that he wrote in that letter back in February 2012. And you can't move fast and break things when you're dealing with legislation. And so it's kind of the inherent friction that I have as a journalist writing daily for websites and turning around stories in an hour or two, and also publishing a book on a fast-moving space like AI, and trying to encapsulate that and make it timeless so that it doesn't just become tomorrow's kindling for a fire, or tomorrow's chip paper, as we'd say in the UK, in which you get safe fish and chips. It's a combination of things. So I think we don't have enough regulators who are up to it. And that's not to say that we don't have any. We certainly have a lot, and some of them are very good, but I think they're not in the majority. And I think, frankly, until a lot of the old people die, they won't be. But at the same time, they're kind of fighting with one arm behind their back, wielding a sword in a gunfight, because tech companies have had 20 plus years of being able to run roughshod, and they've convinced previously regulators to say, oh, okay, we trust you. We know that you're more than us, and so we trust that you can self-police and that you can do what's right for us. And they've been proven wrong in that instance. Yeah, I guess my concern is that these folks are stuck between a rock and a hard place. Either they overregulate and we have nothing, or they regulate judiciously and carefully, by which point the tech has moved on 10 steps and suddenly the actual regulation is meaningless. And I'll be honest, Justin, when it comes to regulation, I never have a good answer because I don't have a solution to it. And I'm certainly not at all qualified to think that I have a solution to it. I just think that it's a problem. And it's kind of a problem that existed long before today and has become entrenched. And I don't know a way out of it.
One of the things you say in the book is this thing about how we are, in fact, moving so quickly that there's no time to slow down and think through some of these complicated questions. I struggle with that all the time. We always say that to ourselves, right? The tech is moving so fast that the regulators can't keep up. I don't know. I don't know how we get out of that just perpetual problem, how to serve the public interest in, at least in most Western economies, it feels like innovation and economic growth are the North Star, as it were. Chuck Schumer called innovation the North Star when he was hosting those AI Insight forums last fall. Is there any chance that we end up being able to reassert the public interest without some sort of catalyzing event, something terrible happening?
I think the challenge is it requires something that is almost impossible, which is for politicians to put aside egos. You mentioned Chuck Schumer there and kind of his AI convocation, and I'm reminded of Gina Raimondo standing on the podium in front of the world's media 10 minutes before the UK Tech Secretary, Michelle Donnellan, was set to unveil the UK's AI Safety Institute and essentially spoiling the party and saying, you've invited me here to London for this Bletchley Park summit that is going to be the world's first AI safety summit. I'm very honored to be here, but also step aside because the US is weighing in and we're going to set the global rules. Thank you very much. And we're going to announce the same thing that you did. And ours is more important. And we've seen this. There's been some really interesting reporting by Politico saying Nick Clegg, of all people, a former UK Deputy Prime Minister, someone who should be defending the importance of legislators in this space, effectively said, we're not engaging with the UK AI Safety Institute because the US one is bigger and more important, and we only have so many things we can do. And so I think if we're to come even close to tackling this problem, you need much more global agreement, and that requires politicians to do the impossible, which is to say, you know what, I don't need to have something that I can put to the electorate to say, look how brilliant I am, vote for me the next time round, and to actually put principles before all of that. And you know, one of the things that I find really notable and really quite worrying is we're a week out from the second AI Global Safety Summit in Seoul in South Korea. And the list of people not appearing is, frankly, almost as long as the people who were due to appear. And I think it's something that kind of has been shaped by my look at the kind of previous reporting about social media of you have all of these countries competing to set standards, and it becomes impossible for big companies, big tech companies, to follow them all individually and produce different flavors. And so they end up just focusing on kind of the lowest common denominator or the most important people, the ones that shout the loudest. And that means that you often have conflicting interests. You know, God, if you talk to some American legislators about what was happening in the EU, they're kind of like the enemy, right? Because we're seen as stifling growth. As you say, Chuck Schumer's North Star is innovation. Talk to enough people in the US about what the EU is doing to tech, and they'll say, these blinking Europeans with their baguettes and their croissants and dark coffee and refusal to serve me a cappuccino before after 11 a.m. They're going to snuff out all of this stuff before it even begins. And that's the challenge I think we have, is it's an impossible task because these people ultimately are accountable to electors, and that's an issue.
I have heard some very derogatory things said about the EU AI Act in the halls of Congress and in the Senate. just in the last couple of weeks, and listening to some of the testimony and conversation that's happening there, almost leading questions like, you know, witness X, why do you think the Europeans got it so wrong when it comes to artificial intelligence? So we'll see if that kind of carries on into the proposed legislation that we are meant to expect from Senator Schumer's effort sometime soon. We'll see what happens. I guess my last question for you, Chris, is about how you keep up with things. This book is reported, I would say. There's lots of evidence of you talking to lots of the individuals involved, from the technologists on through to the folks doing work on the social issues, on through to people who have been caught up in this phenomenon like Pablo that you mentioned at the beginning. How do you think about your craft in terms of covering technology these days? What is it you do?
I just try and keep on top of it because it's a horror, right? I often think of myself as that scene with Charlie Chaplin in, I think it's Modern Life, where he's on the factory line trying to desperately tie the nuts together before the widget moves along the kind of conveyor belt, and actually struggling to do. And I'm lucky in that as a reporter, I've built up a really good database of contacts and sources and experts that I can call upon to essentially answer the phone any time of the morning, noon or night. And I'm very grateful to them for that, because I think I would personally find it annoying if I was pestering as much as I do. But also I'm lucky in that I'm able to work quite quickly. As you say, large parts of this were reported out while also doing stuff for day-to-day publications. And a lot of that kind of iterative reporting feeds into the book. And one of the ways that I tend to work in terms of picking topics for books is that I'm reporting out a subject, not necessarily on a beat per se, because I'm a freelancer. I do stuff for anybody and anything really. But you get to the point where you realize that kind of like a 500-word news story or an 800-word or 1,000-word feature is not really enough to tackle the questions here. And you start to make these linkages of, oh, this event is tied to this bit of reporting that I did about this event 2 months back. And it has this broader context of this legislative movement that happened 6 months ago, which has echoes of this social media trend that happened 2 years back or whatever. And you start to think, actually, there's more to say here, particularly with the people that you speak to. They have these deep, rich stories, or these really brilliant insights. And you mentioned a couple of people like Carissa Release, who has an encyclopedic knowledge of this stuff, and you end up quoting them for 3 or 4 lines in a standard story or feature, and you go, we owe it to the public, to people who want to learn more about this and think more deeply about this, to go deeper on this. And so that's how I do it. And I'm lucky also in that I have some caring responsibilities for a grandparent, but no family at the minute. And I'm very lucky in terms of being relatively secure in terms of work and things like that. So I'm able to work quite efficiently and to drop everything when stuff happens and react to it. And then being able to write a book is a way of bringing together all those thoughts where you go, actually, you know what, like there are deeper meanings to this. And it's important that actually this kind of gets thought about and discussed and those issues are raised.
Already planning the next book?
Already signed a deal for the next book on fake news and disinformation. And then that's going to be a much shorter book. It's more of an image-led thing. That should hopefully be out next year. And then one of the things that kind of ties together a lot of the reporting and the books that I've done in the past, I've done a lot of stuff on like creators and influencers and so on and so forth, and how the world of work is changing. And with generative AI, work is changing even more. And so there's another book after that in very early stages of process. And I feel comfortable talking about it because I hope that I can work quicker than other people who might be listening to it, and think that it might be a good idea of just like how we're not setting up our education system properly for the next generation, who are going to be in a world of gig economy, and they're going to be maybe being a creator, and they're going to have multi-hyphenate jobs and not have a traditional career path. And it's born of kind of, I'm 35, I turned 35 early this month, and born of frustration of doing like a careers aptitude test style thing when I was about 14 or so, where you ticked a load of boxes and then it put it into this kind of old whirring machine, and it came out with, you could be a florist when you grow up, or you could be a baker, or whatever, based on your personality. And yeah, I just thought that wasn't suitable then, certainly not suitable now. So that's potentially the next big project.
That will hopefully present an opportunity for you to come back on this podcast, tell us what you've learned as we go along. But until then, I'll commend to my readers How AI Ate the World, A Brief History of Artificial Intelligence and Its Long Future by Chris Stokel-Walker from Canberry Press, available, I think, wherever you download or even purchase printed copies of books these days. Chris, thank you so much.
Thank you, Justin.
That's it for this episode. I hope you'll send your feedback. You can write to me at justin@techpolicy.press. Thanks to my guest. Thanks to my co-founder, Brian Jones. And thank you for listening.
Tech Policy Press.